In the heart of the most powerful empire on earth, three teenagers were handpicked for a life of luxury and influence. They were given new names, a new education, and a new identity. But it was all a sophisticated system of control. This is the story of how a methodical program of cultural assimilation backfired, and how three young men, stripped of everything they knew, risked a horrific death to defy an emperor and prove some things just aren't for sale. In the year 605 BC, the world trembled before the might of Babylon. Its armies, led by the brilliant and ruthless king Nebuchadnezzar, were an unstoppable force, crushing kingdoms and expanding an empire that stretched across the ancient world. But Babylon wasn't just a military power. It was the epicenter of culture, science, and wealth. Its capital city, with its legendary hanging gardens and walls so thick that chariots could race on them, was the jewel of the earth. But Nebuchadnezzar's strategy for dominance was more subtle than just conquest. He didn't just want to rule over lands, he wanted to capture minds. His policy was one of cultural assimilation. He would identify the best and brightest from the nations he conquered, the most intelligent, the most handsome, the most well-born, and bring them to the very heart of his empire. The goal was simple and sinister: remake them into loyal Babylonians. By converting the future leaders of his subject nations, he could ensure the long-term stability of his throne. Among the first chosen for this elite program were four young men from the conquered kingdom of Judah. They were teenagers, likely around 15 years old, from noble families. They were described as being without any physical defect, handsome, and showing an aptitude for every kind of learning. Three of these young men were named Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You probably know them by different names we'll get to in a minute. Torn from their homes, they were marched hundreds of miles to Babylon, a city of dazzling pagan grandeur. Here, they were enrolled in what can only be described as an imperial indoctrination academy. For 3 years, they would be subjected to an intense re-education program. They were forced to learn the complex Chaldean language and study Babylonian literature, which was steeped in mythology, astrology, and the worship of a pantheon of gods. The curriculum was designed to systematically dismantle their worldview and replace it with a Babylonian one. The psychological pressure didn't stop there. It got personal. The boys were given new names. This was a common practice for conquerors, a powerful symbol of ownership and control meant to sever a person's connection to their past. Their Hebrew names all paid homage to their God. Hananiah meant Jehovah is gracious. Mishael, who is like God, and Azariah, Jehovah is my helper. Every time their names were spoken, it was a reminder of their faith. The Babylonians tried to break that connection. Hananiah was renamed Shadrach, a name possibly linked to a Babylonian god. Mishael became Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego, meaning servant of Nego, another Babylonian deity. With every utterance of their new names, the empire was trying to rewrite who they were, to brand them as property of Babylon and its gods. The final stage of this indoctrination was an appeal to the senses, a taste of the good life. The king assigned them a daily portion of his own rich food and wine. This wasn't just a meal plan, it was a symbol of dependence and compromise. To eat the king's food was to accept his provision, to partake in his culture, and to implicitly honor the gods to whom that food was likely first dedicated. It was a golden chain, offered as a delicacy. This was the trap laid for them. A life of privilege, influence, and power was theirs for the taking. All they had to do was forget. All they had to do was conform. But inside this gilded cage, a silent rebellion was brewing. The program designed to erase their identity was about to collide with a conviction that couldn't be broken. The first test didn't come with the threat of a sword, but with a dinner plate. Faced with the king's rich food and wine, the four Hebrew youths, including Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, made a choice. They politely but firmly refused. This was an incredibly risky move. To refuse a gift from the king was a grave insult, but for them, it was a necessary stand. Their request was simple: a diet of vegetables and water. It was a quiet declaration that they would not be defiled, would not break the dietary laws of their faith, and would not draw their sustenance from the king, but from their God. They understood that small compromises can lead to bigger ones. If they yielded here, where would it end? Their identity wasn't for sale, not even for a seat at the king's table. The official in charge was terrified. He was worried they'd end up looking weak and malnourished, and that the king would literally have his head. But they proposed a 10-day test. For 10 days, they would eat only vegetables and water while the others ate the king's food. The results were astounding. Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and their friend Daniel appeared healthier and better nourished than all the young men who ate the royal food. Their quiet act of faith had been vindicated. This small victory set the stage for everything that followed. They had drawn a line in the sand. They proved to themselves and to the powers of Babylon that it was possible to live in the empire without becoming a part of it. For the next 3 years, they excelled in their studies. They mastered the language and literature of the Chaldeans, but weren't seduced by it. At the end of their training, King Nebuchadnezzar himself found them 10 times more knowledgeable and insightful than all the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. Their competence was undeniable, and so, despite being captives from a conquered nation, these 3 men, now known by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were appointed to high positions of authority, overseeing affairs in the province of Babylon. Think about that. The very men the empire tried to remake in its own image had not only resisted, but had risen to power within it. They were successful, respected, and influential. They had everything to lose. And that's when the real test came. King Nebuchadnezzar was at the height of his power. A master builder, a brilliant general who had never lost a battle, and ruler of a vast empire. But with great power often comes even greater pride. Perhaps driven by his own monumental ego, Nebuchadnezzar commissioned an idol of immense proportions. On the plain of Dura, near Babylon, he erected a towering statue of gold. It stood 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, the height of a modern 9-story building. Its purpose was clear: to be a symbol of his absolute authority and to unify his diverse empire under a single, mandatory act of worship. The king then issued a decree to every corner of his empire, summoning all his high-ranking officials. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as provincial administrators, were among those commanded to attend. The order was absolute and terrifyingly simple. A herald proclaimed it for all to hear. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And the penalty for disobedience? Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing fiery furnace. This wasn't just an empty threat. Execution by fire was a known and brutal punishment in the ancient Near East, making the king's order chillingly real. Massive kilns used for baking the millions of bricks that built Babylon could easily be turned into instruments of horrific execution. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, this was the ultimate crisis. Their private rebellion was over. This was a public test of loyalty, staged before the entire leadership of the empire. There was no hiding. Their faith was based on the absolute commandment: "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol." To bow was to betray the very foundation of their being. To refuse was treason, punishable by an agonizing death. Imagine the scene. The plain is filled with the most powerful men in the world. Before them, The colossal golden statue glints under the Babylonian sun. The air is thick with anticipation and fear. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stand among the crowd, their hearts pounding. They know what they must do. Then, the music begins. A grand symphony echoes across the plain. This is the signal. All around them, thousands of officials fall to their knees. The entire plain becomes a spectacle of mass prostration. But amidst this sea of bowing heads, three figures remain standing. Tall, unmoving, defiant. The courage to stand when the whole world kneels is a power that echoes through history. It's the kind of conviction that changes everything. If this story of defiance inspires you, take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We explore the powerful stories that have shaped our world, and you won't want to miss what's next. And let us know in the comments, what does this story mean to you? In that moment of mass worship, the sight of three men standing was impossible to miss. Certain Babylonian officials, perhaps jealous of these successful foreigners in a high office, rushed to the king with an accusation. This was their chance to eliminate their rivals. "Your Majesty," they began, "there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Nebuchadnezzar was consumed with fury. This was personal defiance, a public rejection of his authority. He ordered the three men brought before him immediately. Standing before the most powerful man on earth, they faced him. Nebuchadnezzar, perhaps finding it hard to believe anyone would dare defy him, gave them one last chance. "Is it true," he asked, his voice dripping with menace, "that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image I have set up?" He repeated the command. "When the music plays, bow down. If you don't, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace." And then he asked the question that revealed the true heart of the conflict. It wasn't just about a statue, it was about ultimate power. He sneered, "Then what god will be able to rescue you from my hand?" It was at this moment that the three men, hardened by years of quiet conviction, gave their remarkable reply. They didn't tremble. They didn't beg. They looked the emperor in the eye. "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." What an opening. They were refusing to even debate on his terms. Their decision was made. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your Majesty's hand. This was a bold declaration of faith, but what they said next elevated their defiance from hope in a miracle to an act of absolute integrity. "But even if he does not, we want you to know, your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." This is the core of the entire account. Their obedience to God wasn't a transaction. Their faith wasn't a contract where they served only if he rescued them. Their loyalty was absolute. Whether they lived or died was in God's hands. But their choice to obey, their refusal to bow, was entirely their own. They had taken away the king's power. He could kill their bodies, but he could not touch their will. He could not command their worship. Nebuchadnezzar's fury exploded into an uncontrollable rage. The calm, unshakable faith of these three men was something his imperial power couldn't defeat. So, he resorted to the only power he had left: brute force. He screamed at his guards, ordering them to heat the furnace 7 times hotter than usual. The command was so urgent and the fire so intense that the flames killed the very soldiers who threw them in. Bound in their court attire, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were cast into the heart of the inferno. As they fell into the roaring blaze, the story should have been over. Nebuchadnezzar, watching the execution, saw something that made him leap to his feet in terror and astonishment. He stared into the swirling heart of the furnace, his eyes wide with disbelief. He turned to his advisors, his voice filled with alarm. "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" His advisors confirmed, "Certainly, Your Majesty." The king exclaimed, his voice trembling, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Inside the very instrument of death, a miracle was unfolding. The ropes that bound them were gone, burned away, but the fire hadn't touched them. They were walking freely, peacefully, in the middle of the inferno. And they were not alone. A 4th figure, one whose appearance was so glorious that even the pagan king recognized it as divine, was with them in the flames. The Empire's ultimate weapon had been neutralized. The furnace, intended as a place of death, had become a sanctuary. The fire meant to destroy them was now the backdrop for a divine power that left the mighty emperor speechless. Nebuchadnezzar, humbled and awestruck, approached the opening of the furnace. The great king, who had demanded worship, now called out with reverence to the very men he had condemned. "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." And so they did. They walked out of the furnace in full view of the stunned officials who had gathered for their execution. The crowd pressed in to see. It was unbelievable. Not a hair on their heads was singed. Their robes were not scorched. And there was not even the smell of fire on them. The power of Babylon had been utterly defeated. The emperor had commanded them to bow before a lifeless statue, and they had refused. Now, that same emperor stood face to face with 3 men who had walked through an inferno without a scratch, living proof of a power far greater than his own. The event on the plain of Dura sent shockwaves through the Babylonian Empire. King Nebuchadnezzar, the man who had just mockingly asked, "What God can deliver you from my hand?" now issued a new decree. He praised the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, declaring that anyone who spoke against their God would be torn limb from limb. The king who demanded worship for his idol now commanded respect for the God who could rescue his servants so spectacularly. And what of the 3 men? They were immediately promoted by the king to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. Their greatest act of defiance, the one that should have cost them their lives, led to their greatest success. But the story of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah is more than a tale of miraculous rescue. It's a profound story about identity. The Babylonian Empire, the most powerful force on the planet, used a systematic program of indoctrination designed to erase who they were. They changed their names, their diet, their language, and their education. They failed. They failed because an identity rooted in unshakable conviction cannot be erased by external pressure. The empire could give them new names, but it couldn't make them forget who they were. It could surround them with luxury, but it couldn't buy their conscience. It could threaten them with death, but it couldn't command their worship. Their story shows that true rebellion isn't always a violent uprising. Sometimes, the most powerful act of defiance is to simply stand when you are commanded to bow. It's the quiet decision to remain true to your core principles, no matter the cost. Their faith wasn't a shield against suffering. They fully expected to die. Their faith was the reason they were willing to walk into the fire in the first place. This ancient account continues to echo through the centuries, a timeless symbol of courage against coercion and integrity against corruption. It forces us to ask some hard questions. What are the forces in our own lives that demand our unquestioning allegiance? What pressures, cultural, political, or social, ask us to compromise our core beliefs in exchange for safety, acceptance, or success? Their defiance changed an empire and proved that the power of a state has its limits, and that limit is the human soul. This story is a powerful reminder that while empires rise and fall and statues of gold turn to dust, conviction is eternal. And it poses one final challenge to us all. What are the golden statues in our world that demand our worship? And what does it really mean to stand when everyone else bows?